Welcome to day 2, full of programming, but according to the schedule, day 3. And today we're going to be talking about physics, cosmology, and creation. But given that today is the feast of Saint Cyril of Alexandria, and the role he had to play in the Council of Ephesus, all right, with respect to the humanity and piecing together the humanity and divinity of Christ, designating Our Lady as Theotokos. We're also at Our Lady's University, so I thought today in prayer we would pray to Our Lady. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, Amen. Hail, Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy, our life, our sweetness, our hope. To be pride, revenge, children of Eve. To be stand up our side, mourning and weeping and sadly of tears. Turn thou most gracious advocate, thine eyes of mercy toward us. And us, our exile, show us to us what's the good of thy own Jesus. O clement, loving, sweet Virgin Mary, pray for us, the Holy Mother of God,
that we may be favor of the
in the Father, Son, and thank you very much. Welcome. All right, so this morning, before we get to our first speaker, who you heard yesterday, a little note about a possible optional activity this evening. On your schedule, you will see at 8 o'clock, trivia night with the Office of Life and Human Dignity. This is optional. The trivia is popular culture based, so lots of fun. Although I don't know why science and religion trivia wouldn't be fun. But if you have the bandwidth, I know these days are exhausting. We were talking this morning over breakfast with someone about personally after these days, it's a lot of thinking we have to do. I normally binge watch Netflix for solid 2 or 3 days after we're done. But if you have the bandwidth, seeing as we're early on, I highly recommend this trivia night and getting to know teachers who are coming to the University of Notre Dame and the McGrath Institute in particular for very similar reasons to you. So we encourage that, completely free, and I think there's drinks and snacks if that's important to you. All right, so friends, without further ado, I'd like to invite Steve Barr, who is present.
All right.
Good morning, Steve.
Good morning.
Again, if you want to see Steve, you're going to have to sit on the right-hand side of the room for the talk. When he's done, he'll be on all 3 screens. And so, Steve, we are very excited to listen to your talk, Modern Physics, the Beginning and Creation.
Okay. So this talk may be a little bit shorter than yesterday, so there'll be more time for questions. And I may not have slides to go all the way through the talk, so you will get to look at my beautiful face for more of the talk. So so the talk is about the beginning and creation of the universe. So I'm going to start, I'm going to emphasize that those really are 2 different ideas, beginning and creation. That's one of the main points of my talk. Then I'm going to first talk about creation of the universe, and then I'm going to talk about the beginning of the universe. So, well, actually, I'm going to start talking about both, but then I'll talk about each one. So for Christian doctrine, the fundamental text about the beginning of the universe is the first verse of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, this verse affirms 2 things: that the universe is created and that the universe had a beginning in time. I think it's important that we understand that these are 2 logically distinct ideas, even though they're tied together by this first verse of Scripture. Creation refers to the fact that the universe depends for its existence upon God. It depends upon God for its being, for its existence, for its reality. Beginning refers to the universe having a temporal starting point, that is, having a history that began at some finite time in the past, rather than a history that stretches infinitely into the past, or maybe a history that goes around in a loop. Now, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, in explaining Genesis 1:1, and there it's the bottom of the screen in black. If you go to section 290 of the Catechism, it says 3 things are affirmed by these first words of Scripture. The eternal God gave a beginning to all things that exist outside of himself. He alone is creator, and the totality of what exists, expressed by the formula of the heavens and the earth, depends on the one who gives it being. So you see here the Catechism, they're distinguishing God, the universe having a beginning, and the universe depending on God for its being, which is creation. Now, although being created and having a temporal beginning, a beginning in time, are distinct ideas, many theologians, philosophers, and ordinary people have seen them as connected in a necessary way. For example, some religious people see the presumed fact that the universe had a temporal beginning as proving that the universe is created. Some people refer to the Big Bang as the moment of creation. And for their part, many atheists think that if the universe which could be shown somehow not to have had a beginning, or to have always existed, it would disprove the need for a creator. It would show there was no creation, and you don't need a creator. Now, I think both are making a mistake in simply identifying temporal beginning and creation. But as I said, these are distinct notions. Now, I'm going to give an analogy to make this distinction clearer. A piece of music, like a symphony, for example, or any piece of music, has an internal sequence of notes, okay, measured by beats or notes. And the beginning of that piece of music, the beginning of the symphony, is simply the first notes in that sequence. Okay? But the creation of the symphony is not a set of notes. The creation of the symphony is something that takes place in the mind of the composer. It is the composer thinking up the symphony, okay, and bringing it into being as a work of art. Now, the composer is not a part of the symphony, and his or her creative thoughts are not somewhere in that sequence of notes. Okay, they're in the creator's mind, the composer's mind. Similarly, a novel is a sequence of words. The beginning of the novel is just the first words in that sequence. Whereas the novel's creation takes place in the mind of the novelist. When you talk about the creation of the symphony or the creation of the novel, you're asking, why is there a symphony? Why is there a novel? For example, the novel, which I've never read, I must confess, Charles Dickens' novel, A Tale of Two Cities, has very famous opening words. The opening words are, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." And if somebody came along and you had a copy of A Tale of Two Cities there, and someone said, "Why is there this novel? Where did it come from?" You wouldn't open it up and point to the first words. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. That's not where the novel came from. That's not why there's a novel. There's a novel because of Charles Dickens, because Charles Dickens created the novel. So that's the difference between the beginning and creation. So, as I said, the beginning or opening of something has simply to do with its internal structure, its internal sequential structure. Whereas the origin of something, as opposed to the beginning or opening, but the origin of something is, in the sense of the ultimate cause of its existence, is something else. I mean, you could dramatize, consider, you could have a novel that had no beginning. Maybe the plot goes around in a loop. I'm told that there's a novel by James Joyce that actually the plot does go around in a circle. And you could even imagine this novel was printed on a scroll that looped around. So there was no first point in the novel. Same thing, you could have a piece of music that just loops around endlessly. There's no beginning. It just goes round and round. They would have no beginning, but it still, in the case of the novel, needs an author. In the case of the music, needs a composer. So in a similar way, if you ask, why does the universe exist? It would be silly to point to whatever events were going on in the beginning of the history of the universe, whether the Big Bang or whatever the first events in the universe were. You should rather point to the mind of its divine author and the creative act of its divine author. So even if the universe did have a history that went around in a loop, or even if the universe had an infinitely long past, and maybe an infinitely long future, it still needs an author. It still needs a divine creator to give it being, to make it real. So divine creation in Catholic teaching is the act by which God confers being upon the universe and all that it contains. As St. Thomas Aquinas put it, God is to all things the cause of being. God's creative act is the reason that the universe is a real universe, one that actually exists, rather than just a possible universe, a hypothetical universe, or a fictitious universe. Creation is the conferring of reality. It follows that God equally creates all things and events whenever and wherever they are located within the internal spatio-temporal structure of the universe. God is the source of being of this bottle of soda I'm holding in my hand. The chair that you're sitting on, God is the cause of its being. Are you sitting on a merely possible chair or a fictitious chair or a merely hypothetical chair? No, the chair you're sitting on has reality. It really exists. And that reality is conferred on it by God. So God is creating that chair right now. So that's why we say in the Creed, creator of all things, visible and invisible. He's created all things that are real and exist. Okay. Now that's analogous to the fact that a composer is equally the creator of every note of the symphony. The composer creates the final notes, the middle notes, just as much as the beginning notes of the symphony. And the author is the author of, the creator of every word of the novel, not just those that come at the beginning of the plot. Okay, so God's creative act is not something that happened once upon a time, a long time ago. I apologize for the garbage truck that's picking up our garbage right now. God's creative act is not something that happened a long time ago. Because it is an act of the divine mind, it has no location in space and time. God's creative act is a single, eternal, timeless act by which he wills the existence of the whole universe and of all its parts from beginning to end. God is therefore the creator of what is happening now, here and now, just as much as he is the creator of what happened 13.8 billion years ago. Now, admittedly, Genesis speaks of God creating in the beginning. In the beginning, God created. And theological tradition also distinguishes, Catholic tradition, between God's act of creating at the beginning and his act of conserving things in existence later. But theological tradition also says that this distinction is really only verbal. It's only in the way we think about things. It's not real. According to Catholic theology, God creating and is conserving the universe are really one and the same, and one and the same eternal, timeless act. So that's the traditional Catholic understanding of divine creation. And you can see from it that physics can have nothing to say about the creation of the universe, even though it may be able to tell us whether the universe had a temporal beginning and about the physical events that happened at or near that beginning, the events within the universe that were going on near the beginning of the universe. Now, some religious people have the notion that the events that happened, that is, the events within the universe, the physical events that happened at or near the temporal beginning of the universe, must have been miraculous in some way, that they can't be described by science, or that they violated the laws of physics. This notion that the beginning events in the universe are somehow violate the laws of physics or beyond natural explanation may be in part due to the fact that cosmologists often, and particle physicists like myself, often speak of the universe having an initial singularity. You've probably heard of that term. And what does this mean? If you attempt to describe the evolution of the universe at its earliest moments using Einstein's theory of gravity, but ignoring quantum mechanics, one finds that there is a first instant of time, call it t=0, at which various physical quantities must have been infinite, including the density of energy and certain curvature of space-time, it's called the Riemannian curvature of space-time, would have been infinite at t=0, which means you can't apply the equations at that point. When you're dealing with infinite quantity, just like you can't divide by 0. So, for example, the density of energy goes as 1 over t squared, where t is the time since the beginning. Well, at t=0, the density of energy would be 1 over 0. You can't divide by 0. So the mathematics breaks down at that point. And that's the singularity. T=0 would be a singularity. Now, what you should know is that this singularity is probably very likely not real. It arises, as I said, we know that it would be there if you do the calculations leaving out quantum mechanics, ignoring quantum mechanics. But we know that's not the right thing to do. Quantum mechanics becomes very, very important near the beginning of the universe. Nobody quite really knows what the beginning of the universe looks like when you take into account quantum mechanics, when you do a calculation in what's called quantum gravity, because we don't have a usable theory of quantum gravity at the moment. So no one knows how to calculate correctly what happens near the beginning, right at the beginning of the universe. But it is expected by many physicists, for good reasons, that if you knew how to do the calculation correctly, there would be no singularity, and that the laws of physics and the equations of physics would not break down at that point. That everything physical would be finite, and the equations would be perfectly usable, and that they would correctly describe what was going on. Okay? So I just want to say that there's no reason to believe that the laws of physics break down at the beginning, and therefore that something beyond physics was happening in the universe at that time, that something miraculous had to be going on. Now, as far as theology goes, there's no reason to expect otherwise. Just as you would expect the first sentences of a novel to obey the same laws of grammar as the later sentences, you would expect the events at the beginning of the universe to obey the same physical laws as the later events. Okay? It would be absurd to suggest that if the laws of grammar apply at the beginning of a novel, that it means somehow the novel has no author. That doesn't follow at all. In the same way, it would be equally absurd to say that if the laws of physics apply at the beginning of the universe, that somehow means the universe has no author. That makes no sense. And yet many atheists make exactly that argument, including the late Stephen Hawking towards the end of his life. He suggested that the full equations of physics, if we knew what they were, may both require the universe to have a temporal beginning and also describe the physical events that occurred at that beginning, which is perfectly reasonable. I also expect that. There's no reason. I mean, that's what you would expect. But he went on to assert that this would render a creator superfluous. He thought that if quantum gravity somehow implied the universe had to have a beginning and described what was happening at that point, then you don't need a creator anymore. But the first thing to be said is that he's making the very mistake that I was spending the first part of my talk explaining, namely confusing creation and beginning. But there's another reply to Hawking made by a physicist just as great as Hawking. And that physicist was Hawking himself. Hawking, when he was younger, in his first best-selling popular book, A Brief History of Time, which he wrote in 1988, he noted that a theory of physics is, quote, just a set of rules and equations, mathematical rules and equations. And that's true. That's all physics, a theory of physics is. And then he asks, what is it that breathes fire into the equations and makes a universe for them to describe? The usual approach of science of constructing a mathematical model cannot answer the question of why there should be a universe for the model to describe. Now, he is actually, at that point in 1988, was putting his finger on the question of creation without realizing it. Let me make the point that he, in using another analogy. I may have a book. The laws of physics are a set of rules, mathematical rules and equations, and they are the rules of the universe and are analogous to the rules of a game. The laws of physics are to the physical universe as, say, the laws of chess are to a game of chess, or the laws of baseball, the rules of baseball are to a baseball game. They describe the rules of chess, or let's say baseball. The rules of baseball tell you how a baseball game begins. It tells you how baseball games end, how they can end, what kinds of things can go on in the game, when, under what circumstances they happen, what their effects are, and so forth, how the baseball game unfolds. If the guy catches the ball, the batter's out, and so on. Okay? It describes, so that's the rules of physics are like that for the universe. Now, I may know all the rules of baseball. I have a book and it has the complete rules of baseball. The one thing those rules don't tell me, they may tell me how a baseball game will unfold and how it begins and ends, but one thing it won't tell me is whether there has ever been an actual real baseball game played, or whether there is one being played, or ever will be one played. As far as the rules are concerned, they could be the rules of just a hypothetical game, a fictitious or possible game. There's nothing in the rules that says there's a real game. Nor do the rules in the book have some kind of power of making there be a real baseball game. Somebody's got to decide to play baseball. In the same way with chess, the rules of chess cannot make there be an actual game of chess. Somebody has to decide to play one. Now, in the same way, the laws, what Hawking is pointing out here, is simply having a set of rules does not tell you or cause there to be an actually existing real universe described by those rules. That's what he said. He could have said, what is it that breathes fire into the equations and makes a real universe for them to describe? In fact, later in the same passage, he said, why does the universe go to all the trouble of actually existing? And that is something, as Hawking said, that the mathematical theory, the theory of physics cannot, he uses the word, cannot answer the question of why there should be a real universe for the model to describe. So what he's admitting here is that it doesn't matter what laws of physics you're talking about. They cannot answer the question of why the universe actually exists, why there's any universe at all, which is the question that creation answers. The reason there's a universe is that God confers being on it. Now, so that's all I'm going to say about creation. I will say this. If somebody asks, why is there a real universe? And this is an old question. The great philosopher Leibniz asked, why is there something rather than nothing? Okay. There could be absolutely nothing, no universe. I'm not just saying an empty universe, empty space, because space is something. It has distances, as a geometry, there are angles and so on, and number of dimensions. No, space is something. I'm not saying empty space. I'm saying nothing, no matter, no space, no time, no nothing. That's perfectly consistent with the laws of physics. So if somebody says, why is there an actual real universe? There are two answers that are logically consistent. One is to say there's no answer. It's just that there just is. That's the atheist answer. It just is. Don't ask why. There's no answer. Or you can say there's a cause of the universe existing, a cause of being. And that's the theistic answer. That's God. That's the answer, that God conferred being upon it. But one answer that makes no sense is to say the laws of physics are the answer. Okay, so that's all I'll say about creation. So now I'm going to turn to the distinct question of whether, and that's the first half of my talk. So I'm going to turn to the distinct question of whether the universe had, in fact, a temporal beginning, or was, as they say, past infinite. What does Christian revelation say? What can philosophy or pure reasoning tell us? And what does empirical science tell us? That is physics and cosmology. So let's start with revelation, divine revelation. Divine revelation, in particular Genesis 1:1, refers to a beginning, as to other passages in the Bible. And Christians have always taken this to imply that the universe had a temporal beginning. Now, some pagans in antiquity mocked this idea. The pagans mocked Jews and Christians for believing that the universe had a beginning in time, had a finite age. St. Augustine, in his Confessions, tells us that pagans would ask Christians, what was your God doing for all that infinite time before he finally got around to making the world a finite time ago? Why did God wait infinitely long before making the world? Now, St. Augustine gave a very profound and very famous answer to the question in the 11th book of his Confessions. Now, what he said was this: time is a measure of change. If time is passing, that means things are changing. It's an aspect. So that means time, the passage of time, implies the existence of changeable things, which means created things. So if time is passing, that means something created already exists, namely the changeable things, whose change is measured by time. If time is passing, something created already exists. Something created already exists means creation has already taken place. So that means it doesn't make any sense. It is a contradiction in terms to talk about a time before creation. You can't have time before creation. And so he said, but if there was no time before heaven and earth, why do they ask what you, O Lord, did then? There was no then where there was no time. So the beginning, as St. Augustine pointed out, of the created world was also the beginning of time itself. God created the world. It's enshrined in Catholic teaching that God created the world from the beginning of time. So the notion of a beginning of time is in Catholic thought. Now, what St. Augustine, that conclusion he reached, was physics caught up to him in the early 20th century. So 15 centuries after St. Augustine, physics had the same insight. Now, modern physics came to this insight by a different route. And St. Augustine started with the idea of the insight that time is something created. It's an aspect of the created world. Whereas modern physics started with the insight that came from Einstein's theory of gravity, that time is something physical, like space. Now, if time or space-time is something physical, then if the physical universe had a beginning, that was also the beginning of space-time. So the beginning of the universe, through modern physics, the beginning of the universe is the beginning of time, same as St. Augustine said. And so the physicists would tell you it makes no sense to talk about a time before the universe. So let's suppose the universe began 13.8 billion years ago, or 14 billion years ago in the Big Bang. Let's suppose that was the beginning of the universe. Then that was also the beginning of time, which means it would make no sense to ask what was going on 20 billion years ago. There's no such time. Just like it would make no sense to ask what's happening on the Earth north of the North Pole. Latitude runs out at the North Pole. You can't go farther north than that. In the same way, if you're going back in time, you can't go farther back in time than the beginning of the universe. That's where time runs out. And if the universe has an end, that would be the end of time. Okay. So Christian doctrine, based on divine revelation, arrived at the conclusion that the universe had a beginning. It was also the beginning of time itself. By the way, there's a corollary of this idea that time is something created. It's a feature of the created world. It means it doesn't apply to God, the divine nature. It doesn't apply to God nature. Because suppose if God had not created anything, there'd be no such thing as time. It tells you that time doesn't apply to God himself. God is outside of time, beyond time, space and time. St. Augustine said, God dwells in the sublimity of an ever-present eternity, a timeless state. It's ever-present. There's no past and future for God. He lives in an eternal present. And St. Thomas spoke of God dwelling in the nunc stans, the now that stands still. Okay, so that's what Christian doctrine tells us the world had a beginning. What does philosophy tell us? What if we didn't have Christian revelation? Well, a very important Christian philosopher, St. Thomas Aquinas, was of the view that philosophy, without the aid of divine revelation, just natural human reason, can prove that the universe is created, but he did not think that it could prove that the universe had a temporal beginning. He said, we know that the universe had a temporal beginning, but only because God revealed that to us in Genesis. Now, other philosophers and theologians disagree. For example, his great contemporary, St. Thomas's contemporary, St. Bonaventure, thought that you could prove that the universe had a beginning. Certain Islamic philosophers felt that also. And a contemporary Christian philosopher, William Lane Craig, also believes you can prove the universe had a beginning. St. Thomas disagreed. Now, I'm just going to give you quickly one of the arguments of St. Bonaventure, that time must have a beginning. Okay? So he was think of time as elapsing in a sequence of days, just to make life simple. So I'm showing you there a sequence of days. He said, let's suppose, St. Bonaventure said, let's suppose the world is infinitely old. He thought that led to a contradiction, to an absurdity. So imagine an infinite sequence of days stretching into the past and into the future. And there's one that I labeled today. That's this day. And then he thought, well, if the universe is infinitely old, then there must be some day in the past that's infinitely far in the past. And I made that into a little red D also, infinitely remote past day. And then he said, well, that leads to an obvious contradiction, because suppose you started at that infinitely remote past day. Well, the next day would also be infinitely in the past from today. And the day after that, and the day after that, no matter how many days go by, you're still infinitely far in the past compared to today. And so you'll never reach today, which means that infinitely remote past day is not really in our past, because you can't get from there to here by the passage of days. And so you got a contradiction. Well, the fallacy here, which is immediately recognizable to people who are exposed to modern math, is that the number of past days can be infinite without there being any particular day that's infinitely far in the past. And that sounds weird, but it's actually obvious in a way. Consider the infinite sequence of natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. There are an infinite number, and that sequence never ends. So all that sequence goes on infinitely to larger and larger numbers, but all the numbers in that sequence are finite. And so the same thing of the days in the past. There's an infinite number of them, but each one is a finite time ago. Anyway, there's another fallacious argument that St. Bonaventure used, and St. Thomas saw through these arguments, and he rightly rejected them. So St. Thomas, you might say, well, this might puzzle people. So St. Thomas thought that as far as philosophy is concerned, it was possible, as far as he could tell, to have a universe that was infinitely old. And only revelation tells us that it isn't. Now, this may puzzle people who've heard of the so-called first mover argument. A lot of people think, well, St. Thomas had in Aristotle a first mover. God is the first mover. And what a lot of people think they were talking about is the following. You have something moving like a pool ball, a billiard ball. Well, why is it moving? Because another ball hit it. Well, why is that ball moving? Because one hit that. And each ball is set in motion by a previous ball's motion. And they argue, well, that can't go on forever in the past. There had to be a first moving ball, a first mover. That's not what they were talking about. So please do not use the first mover argument with your students, because first of all, the argument is actually extremely subtle and is not what it sounds like. They were not talking about an infinite sequence of events going on and there had to be a first event in that sequence. That's not at all what they were saying. In fact, St. Thomas explicitly denied that was a good argument. He said, you could imagine a sequence, a man who is begotten by his father, who is begotten by his father, who's begotten by his father, and so on. And there's no philosophical reason that he could see why that couldn't have gone on infinitely into the past. So the first mover argument is not what you think. And it's very subtle. The real first mover argument is very subtle and hard to understand. But the one that most people think a lot of people think he was saying, he did not. He did not make that argument and did not accept its validity. Anyway, so at least as far as St. Thomas is concerned, you can't prove, philosophy can say nothing about whether the universe had a temporal beginning. What does empirical science tell us? And this is the last part of my talk. Well, as far as until about 100 years ago, it really was not in a position to tell us anything much about whether the universe had a beginning. But a lot of indications seem to point until the 20th century to the universe having an infinite past. They weren't proofs, but they were sort of indications that suggested the universe was infinitely old. For one thing, in Newtonian physics, one assumed that space stretched in all directions infinitely, and it seemed natural that the time coordinate also stretched infinitely into the past and future. Moreover, in the middle of the 19th century, physicists discovered the law of conservation of energy, which said that energy cannot be created or destroyed. There's always the same amount of energy. It just changes from one form to another. So if there's always the same amount of energy, then as you go back in the past, it seems like you have to go back forever because the amount of energy has got to always be the same. And this also, chemists discovered that in chemical reactions, the number of atoms, we would say in today's terms, the number of atoms never changes in a chemical reaction. And so it seemed that matter, energy, space, and time had always existed and always would. And so you find, for example, the great Nobel Prize-winning chemist Svante Arrhenius saying, the opinion that something can come from nothing is at variance with the present-day state of science, according to which matter is immutable. Okay? Matter and energy, they're immutable, so they have to always have been here. A famous physicist, Walter Nernst, said, to deny the infinite duration of time, he meant into the past and the future, would be to betray the very foundations of science. So that's the way it looked back then. Now, people realized back more than 100 years ago that the Earth had a finite age, that the Earth had a beginning, because they realized that if the Earth is cooling down, will eventually cool down, and since the Earth is still hot inside, it means the Earth has only been around for a finite time. So people understood that. They even estimated how old the Earth is. And there were scientists who argued from the second law of thermodynamics that the universe must have had a beginning. But that view did not seem to prevail. That did not seem to be the dominant view. So it was hard to make sense of the idea that the universe could have had a beginning, to see how that could have worked from the point of view of physics. So the idea began to prevail among scientists, at least those who were not religious, that the universe had always existed. And to many people, as I said yesterday, the idea of a beginning came to seem like the relic of religious mythology. But thinking took a dramatic turn early in the 20th century. It started with Einstein's theory of gravity, called general relativity, which was published in 1915. Now, in Einstein's theory, space and time form a four-dimensional manifold, which one can think of as like a physical fabric. They can bend and ripple in response to the matter and energy which fill it. In the 1920s, a Russian mathematician named Alexander Friedmann and a Belgian theoretical physicist, Georges Lemaitre, who was also a Catholic priest, showed independently of each other that the equations of Einstein's theory of gravity could describe a universe that is expanding. That is not just a universe in which matter is moving apart from other matter, but a universe in which space itself is stretching to make the universe larger. Now, Lemaitre was aware of astronomical observations that showed that distant galaxies were flying away from each other, or they're receding from us. And on the basis of those observations and his own theoretical calculations, he proposed that the universe is indeed expanding from an initial explosion, which he called the primeval atom, and which is now called the Big Bang. In the 1960s, cosmic radiation left over from that Big Bang explosion was discovered by Arno Penzias and Robert W. Wilson, who received the Nobel Prize for that discovery. And since then, evidence for the Big Bang has accumulated rapidly. And there's now no doubt among fundamental physicists and cosmologists that there was a Big Bang about 14 billion years ago. In the standard model of cosmology, the Big Bang is assumed to be the beginning of the universe and thus of matter, space, and time itself. Now, that doesn't resolve the question definitively, because there are many speculative ideas. They're not really theories, because they're just the speculative scenarios, really. We call them scenarios in physics. That the Big Bang was not the beginning of the universe, but rather just one episode in its history. that the history, there was a pre-Big Bang history of the universe. And there's a number, and people are constantly coming up with scenarios of this type. Some of them are the bouncing universe idea, another is called the ekpyrotic universe, another is called eternal inflation. However, and I won't go into what those are unless I'm asked in the Q&A, I'd be happy to go into it. But there are a number of reasons to believe that even if there was a pre-Big Bang history of the universe, that pre-Big Bang history itself had a beginning at some point. One argument is the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics says that entropy, which is a measure of disorder, is all constantly increasing on the whole. And that's why events in our world are sort of unidirectional. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. You can't unspill milk. You can't unshatter a glass. There's things that only go one way. And that's because things are going from order to disorder on the whole. You go from the orderly glass to the disorderly fragments on the floor when you drop it. You don't see the disorderly fragments jump up and reassemble into a glass. And because disorder is always increasing, you can't have the universe last forever. That's why you can't have what's called a perpetual motion machine. A perpetual motion machine is a machine that could run forever. But we know nothing runs forever. They wear down. They break down. We get old. Mountains erode. Paper weather gets yellow and crumbles. Everything wears down and wears out and decays and dies. And that's the second law. And that tells you that the universe cannot be infinitely old. Because if it were infinitely old, it would itself be a kind of perpetual motion machine. But there's other arguments also against a universe that's infinitely old. So physics doesn't definitively prove it, but the indications are fairly strong, theoretical indications that the universe had a beginning after all. And that's kind of a vindication for Jewish and Christian thought, because as I said, in ancient times, the pagans mocked the idea of a universe that had a beginning. And in modern times, atheists have tended to prefer the idea that the universe has existed forever and tended not to believe that the universe had a beginning. And it turns out, most probably, that physics is telling us that the universe did have a beginning, just as Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 told us. There was a beginning. And that's where I think I'll end my talk.